Hi, thank you so much for each of your really interesting presentations. Two questions for two different presenters, so I'll say them both. Jaden, you talked about perpetual affordability. Can you explain that more?
Thanks, great question. I think that was on slide 28. Okay, so you can do perpetual affordable housing in a whole bunch of different ways. The core idea is that the resale value of the home is capped. It's limited. So you buy in at a certain price point, and then establishing a resale value to some benchmark is implied within the purchase. So we're looking at what that mechanism is. It can be to consumer price index, a flat rate of 2%, whatever it happens to be, inflation, whatever it is. But your buyer buys in at a certain market rate, and then at time of resale, they are restricted on the amount of equity they can pull out. So for us in Calgary, the idea is for perpetual that you have to have a very low entrance point into the product to compete with our kind of fledgling market right now. So we're looking at two sites that have low land value, which helps keep costs low, always does. And we're looking at innovative design strategies to keep costs low as well. And that's a colloquial way to say build with product, build wood instead of concrete, and don't build underground parkades, because both of those things are very expensive. So on my downtown sites, if I can build creative and interesting wood frame without a whole bunch of underground parking, I can keep my cost to build low, add that to the fact my land cost is low, and I can get into the market at 40% below where the condo guys are, sell, and that's attractive enough for my buyer to come in and be beholden to this cap on the amount of equity they can pull out.
Okay, so there'd be like a monitoring compliance kind of thing for your line of business.
Instrument on title, yeah,
Okay.
is how we're looking at it right now.
Okay, thanks. My second question is for Sasha. You spoke about the kind of people-based outcomes, and you said something like, this might be too much for us right now. You kind of said it at the end, like, this is too much, we should just focus on, the place-based ones. At least that's kind of what I heard. So I wanted you to just expand on that and what you meant by saying, these are difficult to achieve, and we have such little, I don't know, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. Just like Jay, I had 25 more slides, but the people-based outcomes, and indeed in many different studies, they're measured in terms of human social capital, also individual advancement in terms of economic opportunities, even health outcomes. So they're very, very ambitious and indeed require longitudinal studies, require a long-term approach so that people had a chance to really experience that environment, not just the immediate home, but also the neighborhood itself, to build those connections and indeed to develop a trajectory of their own positive transition into economic opportunities. And so very often, and obviously from the US programs, but as well as the programs that had a very long-term implementation in the UK context, as well as France and the Netherlands, people are coming back with these evaluations and saying, yes, we've achieved great results in terms of the physical rebuilding and re-engineering these neighborhoods and places, but people really don't improve their health outcomes significantly. They don't really have a sense of belonging. They're still excluded. There isn't really social capital that has been shaped up. And I think sometimes with these evaluations and in our academic world, we are stuck in the ivory tower, really looking at all of these wonderful things that we expect will come with access to a place that we call home. But indeed, is that realistic? Particularly in places where we have this small, very residual, and very challenging to build and operate component that is social or affordable housing. And it's just adjusting some of these expectations and perhaps talking about, yes, all of these ingredients, but it's more about the social return on investment, with the caveat that indeed it takes time as well to manifest itself. So in terms of metrics, we're kind of developing these metrics, taking a lot of evidence from other places where such studies and evaluations have been applied, but also in the Canadian context, taking it with a grain of salt and recognizing the fact that the partnerships are very, very challenging to form, operate, finance. And so along the continuum, what we are looking at is really laddering of these opportunities, mixing them up, but also laddering expectations. We want to give them a chance to start so that we have the Regent Park experiment, we have the Olympic Park Village experiment, we have the the Griffin Town in Montreal, where they also mix and match, and they also have the affordable housing opportunity, as well as the co-op for the artists, as well as the rental at near market rates. So this was my message. Give it a chance. One project at a time, but indeed with a strategic vision of what we would like to do, so that we can weather the storm and go through the booms and busts, and we're not really dealing with a risk that is impossible to manage.
Actually, I have too many questions. I will start with 3 and I will leave it then. I will complete the rest. So my first question to Vincent, regarding the company size. We saw some companies in US like operating 40 units, 40,000 units and 90,000 units, some 100 something. Do you think here in our economy, there is limitation for the size of company?
So, I mean, in the Toronto context, I don't think it's the size of the company that's the challenge, or the number of units that's the challenge. It's the funding formula for TCHC that's the challenge. So 60,000 units, 90% of which are rent geared to income. You know, for example, in 2020, our budget next year is going to be about $1 billion. That's half of it is capital and half of it is about operating. And when your rent, it doesn't even come close to covering, you know, even the operating side of the business. It's just not a sustainable model. And the city of Toronto, when they created TCHC, it's been perpetually underfunded. So on an annual basis, the city gives TCHC about $200 million in subsidies. So they fund nonprofits and other social housing agencies in the city at about 70 to 75%, you know, of the rent of the average market rent. TCHC has held at about $240 million in subsidies since it was created. So the statistics is something like we're at about 50% average market rent is what the city is funding us at. So it's not really about the size, it's just not a sustainable model.
Could I add to that just one, really, I'll be brief. You know, when you think about scale and size, it's interesting point. On one hand, scale and size in real estate matters. So if we have in Calgary owners, not-for-profit owners, I'm going to talk about not-for-profit world, and that owner operates one building and that building has 50 units, that scale sucks. It's not a good scale. It just doesn't make sense. Now, there is such thing in real estate, and we can look both on the not-for-profit, really any form of ownership, public, not-for-profit, or for-profit, where you could get it to a scale that the company can be too big, A, and B, you can end up in a situation, it's kind of economics 101, when you have too few people controlling a segment of a market, where in theory, if private sector owns a whole bunch of rental units in Calgary, and private sector guys are 5 of them, nothing is stopping them from saying, these are going to be the rents, take it or leave it. right? So we just have to think about real estate is also about economics, and diversity is not a bad thing to a point. One building of 50 units, not great. 5 people owning all the real estate in the city, not great either, right? So it's the balance.
Second question to Jay regarding the transforming offices to housing. Did you explore anything or any studies for that in Calgary? Like, is it a
Yes.
challenge or opportunity or what?
It's both. It's certainly based on simplicity of supply and demand. It's something a lot of people are looking at right now. You know, we got 30% vacancy, public discussed vacancy rate in downtown Calgary. Many of those buildings are B class or at the effective end of their lifespan. So yeah, a lot of companies are looking at what to do with those buildings. So I'll give you the example of one we have. So our old office was in something called the Ravens building or Ravens building. It's located in the downtown West End. That was our office for many years. It has a mouse infestation, so we've subsequently moved out last fall. Anyway, so it's a 6-story building. It looks like it's ripe for a redevelopment or a refurbishment. Every time in my history, and certainly with this building, that I've looked to change a building from a different use, office or whatever it might be, to residential, and you do the math, it becomes more expensive to refurb than it is to knock it down and build again. And it's purely a function of that office use, not typically office in Calgary, not being, not making a lot of sense and easily transferable to a residential use. Just totally different way those buildings were built, and many of them are very old. Many of them are filled with asbestos. So you have a lot of challenges with the old buildings, and refurbishing them becomes so expensive and cost prohibitive that you're better off to knock it down and build something more suitable for your client than take something that doesn't work.
Can I continue?
The only people who did it really well in Calgary, and if you are interested in office to residential conversion, is Strategic Group. Yeah. Strategic Group does it, so they have a model that's really, I think, replicable across really anywhere because they have a really great typology. You are shaking your head. We'll have that.
Yes and no. It really is building by building, and the strategic model is based on cost control.
Agreed.
Yeah, 100%.
But also, I think in the long run, it's also about reuse and adaptive reuse. And during the downturns, like in Toronto, the 90s, people were giving away office buildings for $1 and property taxes, with the provision that will be converted to rental housing. Okay, Sean, I mean, you really, yes. So Sean really needs to be monitored very closely, as he's such an asset to the city of Toronto. We're not letting him really, okay. But please, Abby, just keep it under control. No, so a lot of that was done in Toronto, and indeed quite successfully done. Also Vancouver, but indeed it's a much more buoyant real estate market. So condo conversions were leading the pack in the 90s and even early 2000s in downtown Vancouver. So it is about economics, but it's also about, again, a different return on investment, and the fact that we cannot really demolish and build new all the time. I mean, although buildings here disappear within less than a day, and then something else comes in. But do we have another question? Yes. Well, maybe we need to be fair and come back to you again for your third question. Don't let it go. Okay.
All right, this is a bit of a broad question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. So there was a lot of discussion on mixing people, mixing incomes, and even thinking of housing as a continuum or a spectrum. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what the role of market housing is in mixing people and offering choice for housing. So I think this is especially relevant for Calgary when we know that only about 30% of households are couples with children, and yet 60% of our housing stock are single detached. So I've just been thinking about this a lot and just wondering what your thoughts are on market housing starting to fill those need gaps. And new construction will always be expensive, but if we don't start offering more choice or building up that stock, in the long run, how are we expecting that more of that spectrum or continuum will fill those different needs and mix people and incomes? So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. Thanks, Sasha. So our project in Martindale, Northeast Community, it's right near a gigantic and multi-use recreation facility called the Genesis Center, so, and near a train station as well, C-train. So we've got great amenity around this project. And the idea of the project was, as us functioning as developer builder and taking on that very significant risk, we were going to do something different. We were going to mix our program participants, so the person taking advantage of the loan, with the regular market buyer. So one of the terms of us acquiring the land from the city of Calgary, which we did, is that 50% of the real estate, the square footage of the site, must be sold through our program, which implies the affordable housing component of what we do, the different part of the spectrum. And we've been honoring that as we've gone through. In fact, 2/3 of the unit sales to date, of which there are 40, it's pretty good, since we launched earlier this year, 2/3 of those units have been sold through our program. So it's implied that there's a different socio-economic makeup of that buyer and client to the market buyer. And we've seen that on site. We've seen that mix of people across this townhouse community. So it's working very well. That's one of the social outcomes that's different than the pure financial driver. So from our perspective, acting as developer, it works well. We've got the benefit that our margin expectations are different than what a for-profit builder would be. So we have the ability to do that kind of mix. The question you actually asked, though, about what should the builder, developer, the market be doing to satisfy that, having worked in development for many years now on condo projects, where we have attempted to put in different types of product type in that unit applicable to different market segments, it's very challenging to do in a small building being, let's say, one tower, one mid-rise apartment building, 200 units, call it. It's very difficult to target separate markets within a separate building. So the small micro suite, the 400 square foot studio for the young urban buyer, with the 3-level townhouse on base for the young urban family that wants the urban amenity around them. Buildings typically take on a marketing idea and concept of their own, and they will attract a certain type of builder to that building. So it's very difficult to sell different types of affordability ideas and components within a building across a spectrum of buyer groups. It's very challenging.
We can switch up, yeah.
Sure. I think it's not. Oops. I don't think it's just a Calgary's adjustment in the marketplace that is taking note of demographics and changing needs and really a new wave of people that are coming to cities. But there is also a kind of a market response as well. The suburbs are changing. The typology and the mix in the suburbs is changing. The faces of the people that move to the suburbs are changing. A lot more diversity in terms of income, social status, also ethnicity. But indeed, the missing link or the weak link in that market-driven response is a complete lack of the social or the affordable housing piece that is controlled by the non-market sector. So in a way, a lot of the new suburbs will have a lot more diversity and will have the condominium developments, townhouses, walk-up apartments, but especially the condo towers very often will end up, these are the mom-and-pop investors, and then they will actually rent it out to the people that can pay the rent and provide return on investment. In some of the studies that we did, very often, you know, the condo tower ends up 50-60% being rental. But it is controlled by the small investor, not the private or the rental landlord that operates this as an asset on a long-term basis. So, and that's where the speculation element kicks in, with everyone trying to get their small return on their little investment. So it's a very, very different response from the one that ideally we would like to achieve with this kind of social mix that we are talking about, the type of social engineering where really different housing typologies are also connected to different type of ownership and ability really to have a ladder of housing opportunities. Sometimes in our context, these are broken ladders. It's just people don't necessarily have the ability to get in.
I just wanted to add one thing to that the market question. There is the financial piece of it, and I think that's important because obviously we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing in Toronto without a robust market for condominiums. But there's also a social aspect of it, and part of it is changing the stigma that's been long associated with these, with at least in Toronto Community Housing Corporation's perspective, like a stigma around social housing and RGI tenants. And so kind of introducing different kind of ownership models and tenures and built form types into the community, that's what's vital for a successful mixed income and mixed use community. What I didn't highlight in the presentation is we've also built seniors buildings in Regent Park. We make sure that each block is mixed, meaning an RGI building will never be beside another RGI building. So we've been mixing each block as we develop the community so that every development has to have at-grade units. So even if you're building a condo, you have to build the row houses just like we do, and you're going to build grade unit-related units. So when you're walking down the street, you won't know which one is a TCHC unit and which one is a market ownership unit. And in phase 3, we've also added in market rental, so there's a new market rental going in. We've also built in kind of a long-term care home that just recently opened, and much like what's being done in Calgary as well is what I didn't highlight is I just need to pick the number up. 223 affordable home ownership loans that we've granted to Regent Park tenants in Regent Park. So 16 of those are through a program through Mr. Gadden, called the Foundation Loan Program. And so when we started Regent Park, one of the questions we always get asked from tenants is, how do I buy a house? How do I benefit from what you're doing? And so we created a home ownership program where we actually give 35% down payment assistance. And it requires the tenant to put 0 down. And so they need to qualify for a mortgage of 65% to cover the remaining balance of the home. But it's also interest-free, and the loan's forgiven. Well, it used to be forgiven after 20 years. Now you still have to repay it whenever you sell the house. But much like the program that you're running, we will collect a percentage of the appreciation of that home. But again, if the market collapses in Toronto, then the loan wouldn't be paid back.
I will just briefly add to your question. Your question was, what's the role of the private sector in mixing people? Incomes, needs, correct? So we could argue whether or not the private sector is doing a great job or not. I think they're actually doing an okay job when you look at the financial performance that they need to meet as one way of looking at this. Where the not-for-profit developer an owner comes in is we say, because we are social-driven, mission-driven organizations, so we say, where do we need to be? Where are the gaps in the market, right? So I think we house people who can afford $300 a month when they live in our Ursa pod, maybe $500. There's no profit to be made in the private sector in that model, 0. So to bring the private sector equity to that model, unless there is some broad subsidies or, and again, using a profit, it's just not going to work. And that's where the not-for-profit, strong not-for-profit comes in and says, look, let's look at it as a continuum. Let's not make sharp distinctions here. But which part of the market, it's all market, is not being served? Let us take that part of market. And why can we do it? Because we don't take the same amount of profit.
I have a question for Vincent. I'm curious if you can speak to the period of time of 12 years as the amount of time to sort of reflect on lessons learned, and thinking about like how many of those lessons were actually surfaced 10 years ago plus, and on the flip side, how much are you still looking at Regent Park to learn down the road? Like what components do you feel like there is still a lot to be learned that 12 years hasn't been enough time to really reflect on and scale or take to other places?
That's an interesting question. I think, the first buildings in Regent Park started occupying in 2010. So really, it hasn't been a full decade yet of people living in the units, but that's really when we started to get those lessons learned, right? Like, when we're planning with the community, obviously there's lessons learned through the planning approvals process and how to make sure that we're engaging with tenants. So through that process, we make sure there's, like, as was highlighted, 47 different languages spoken. So we need to make sure that there was interpretation at every public meeting. We had to make sure that we translated everything that we printed, and we recognized that TCHC tenants didn't have access to the internet, or, so there was challenges in how do you communicate to such a large community so that they stay informed. So there were lessons learned around that at the front end. And then once the building started occupying, there were lessons, we started to learn the lessons around how are families using the units. And so as I highlighted around the skin in the game piece, there was a period of time where TCHC's board did not want to invest anything in revitalization. And so what was happening was we were designing buildings to make sure that we were within a certain cost. Because RGI tenants, it doesn't matter how big your unit is, you're going to pay the same amount of rent. You could have a 5-bedroom unit or you could have a 2-bedroom unit. It's going to continue to be based on your income. And so there was a reluctance in the leadership at TCHC to build things that they couldn't capture value back from. So we were building townhouses with no basements. We weren't building balconies for TCHC buildings. So when you walk into Regent in phase 2, the earlier buildings, TCHC's buildings have no balconies, but all the condos do. That ruins my game that we usually play on tours, where we ask you to point out which ones are TCHC markets. So just pretend that you didn't hear that. But so we were trying to control costs by not building excess GFA for things that we didn't think that we weren't required to build for them. All we were required was a certain square footage for bedroom space and kind of the overall unit. We've learned from that now. We realize these are large households that are occupying these 3, 4, 5, 6-bedroom units. And according to the regulations in Ontario at least, each bedroom requires double occupancy. So you could have a 6-bedroom unit and at least 12 people living there, and then not to build storage for these households, is kind of, it just doesn't work. And so what we were finding, what we're learning now is we need to adapt, and we need to, it costs more to build rental replacement. And so we recognize that now. Are there still more lessons to be learned? 100%. One of the slides that I had, I didn't highlight the picture, but as I mentioned about the crime statistic and the grade-related units, I showed a picture of a public park. It's called the Linear Park. And it's on the side of the building. It's owned by the City of Toronto. It's kind of it runs along the side of the Allen Expressway at our Lawrence Heights community. And then the youth were telling us that they would come out of the subway entrance. There would be people in cars waiting for them to come out of these subway entrances, and then they were chasing them down this linear parkway, which was designed with stakeholders in the city to be open and accessible. So now, and they demanded us to put in gates. Well, that goes against the whole purpose or whole objective of revitalization. So now we're going to install bollards so that at least the cars can't go down and chase the youth. So these are kind of the things that we're learning along the way. We try to apply urban design best practices, but like I said, it doesn't necessarily always match up with the realities that our tenants are facing in these communities.
Hi. Sasha, I really liked your presentation or discussion around partnerships, because at the essence of partnerships is this sense of what are you giving and what are you getting. What I'm curious about in terms of the different types of partnerships is how they manifest themselves in essentially legal agreements, because that is really where partnership lands, is in legal agreements, and whether through your research and the work that you've done, you can share at some point, or have a collection of documentation about how to share surpluses, how to balance risks on each side of the partnership. I think that would be a really interesting aspect to the work that you're doing, and I wondered whether you were thinking about that, or is that something we can hope to see in the future? I think a library of that would be great.
Thanks, Abby. Yes, and I'm glad that you didn't criticize me for putting that 100 million taxpayer cost to the Olympic Village project. I think that that's an excellent question, and indeed the notion of a partnership, no doubt, and we heard a reoccurring message about risks and also efficiency and costs and these cost constraints. And even in the European presentations, when it's a much more generous world, they still control for costs. And it's also very important that the regulatory framework is set up in the correct way so that the risks and the rewards are really, truly shared. But there is also another piece, which is around the effectiveness of a partnership. They're so difficult, and what I found in that research, particularly in the Canadian context, every partnership is so different and is struggling with the same thing, rediscovering the bicycle all over again. So it would be really great if some things are shared. And in fact, this is the grand idea behind this, the symposium as well, sharing that empirical evidence, sharing the narrative, the stories, and so that everyone benefits, both the practitioners and also the politicians, the policymakers, the planners that are stranded, setting up certain rules of the game and adhering to that. The legal aspect is profoundly important. So, because at the end of the day, the success in the context of redevelopment really hinges on the successful performance of the real estate market. There is no doubt about that. And that's where the private sector comes in with their experience, because they've been managing those risks in various markets over time. And at the end of the day, it's about effectiveness as well. In some cases, yes, it takes 12 years to revitalize a portion of Regent Park, and there is still more to come. And we heard about stories in Washington, D.C., and Chicago, and Francisco, and the Montreal story is very inspiring. But sometimes the partnerships take 5 to 7 years, so that's really thinking of partnering. And by the time, you go through booms and busts, and so there is that idea of really making it more transparent, more explicit. It's not business as usual. There would be diversity in that model, no doubt about it. Hybrids, such as the nonprofits, come in depending on how powerful they are. But the bottom line, actually, it's about the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. And so again, building on the strength of each sector in that, again, I come back to my label, PP&P, and understanding how it works together. So yes, that is the idea. The short answer is yes, we plan to disseminate as much as possible. Very, very difficult to even describe the partnerships. I mean, it's just going after simple metrics such as how much was invested, what was the initial idea about the mix, what are the rents. Like sometimes you feel like you're an auditor general coming to town and people fear, right? I mean, no, it's not about that. It's actually being positive and telling a good story.
I want to add something to that, if you don't mind. That's an awesome question. Two things. This is like a tip or a couple of tips. Get a really good lawyer. You're going to be doing partnerships with people that hire good lawyers for a living. Like they literally are in the business of hiring good lawyers. So lawyer up. That doesn't mean get ready to sue anybody, but just be ready to have someone reviewing your documents and making sure they're tight. That's really, really important. Number two, partner with people that share your vision. If you partner with people that share your vision and you know that right off the hop, you're going to be protected to a degree when times are tough. So the organization I run is in a position right now where times are not perfect. We're okay, but it's not great. So what does it come down to when you're arguing over carrying costs on stuff? The strength of your agreement and what's in your agreement. So if your agreement is loose, then you're going to have a lot of debate. If your agreement is not loose, then you're going to have less debate. And you're going to have definitions you can come back to and not have to argue on anymore. But the idea of having access to those agreements so all of us can learn, I think is brilliant. I think we should do something about that.
Hi. I've got just some comments and questions. One is about partnership, and I think the continuum of the way the continuum shown by you all. I think the three of you are from different continuum of the sectors. That's why the goals and vision of each continuum is different. I want to focus on development because I'm also a development guy before. And the three of you also mentioned the same thing about funding. And the funding from the three continuum is totally different. But I want to concentrate on what Jaden said, which is to understand what is needed in the market. For me, in terms of Calgary, I think that, and the whole of Canada, there are a lot of students who comes out, and that's why a lot of people want to rent, because they have student loans. We are in a society of debt. But yet, in the traditional way, just same like Jaden, I think people should have a home, and the finance institution should help them to come up with an easy payment plan. Okay, so I think that's a big, even as a migrant, there are a lot of skilled migrants who come as professionals. They don't come without anything, you know. So there is, the only thing is that to make them ease into that attainable. Of course, on the other spectrum, there are people who really just come alone and they need to rent. So I think there are different spectrum. Number one, I need to know, like, is financial institutions, don't say your own funding, is financial institutions like bank helping you all? I'm talking to numbers, number one. The second one I like to share also is, as developers and designers and whatnot, we can make a place, even in affordable house, look good through simple things, just like upgrading a playground, just like community service, which I see in some of the affordable homes we visit. So I think it's simple things that bring community. It's not like, you know, you need to have a fantastic building outside. And I think it's the simple place making where people can come together and share, people can come together and have occasions. So I think it's more of the place. These are simple things a developer can give back to the community. Just your thoughts on it.
I'll just quickly hit number one, then I'll pass it on. So we have relationships with mortgage specialists that help our clients go through the pre-approval and mortgage approval process. It's all based on relationships with individual people. So we work with big banks, we work with all different tiers of lenders, right? We deal with different types of groups as well. The most success we have are with the individuals that work for banks that care about our client. So we have a great connection to Scotiabank, as an example. The people that work for us and with us through Scotiabank understand the needs of our client. They love working with our client because they see the social benefit in their own life and for the life of the city in moving people into home ownership. So their hustle in moving people brings them success. And the groups that are less interested in placing people, because it's harder work, our clients are very high touch, they're less successful. So we align ourselves with people that understand, again, the vision of what we're trying to do, and they'll work harder to move them into home ownership. I'll just stay out of urban design stuff right now.
I'll just briefly comment on your point about developers providing good playgrounds, good community areas. On the not-for-profit side, again, we are a not-for-profit developer. Because of our mission, which is housing people with special needs, and one of our goals is to create really strong communities within strong neighborhoods. And I would be shocked if, probably Toronto Community Housing Corporation, Calgary Housing Company does similar things. In all of our buildings, new builds, and as much as we can retrofit, we have what we call community rooms. Those community rooms have access to outdoor amenity spaces as much as possible. Because of the different populations that we house, we are looking at designing our common rooms that can be adapted to ceremonies such as smudging. So we are installing separate ventilation systems to be able to have a smudging ceremony. Right, so I think when it comes to design and good community building, there's really a lot of great ideas, and I love how you put it. We don't build buildings which are fancy. Every time we sit down with architects, we say, okay, like I go through the plans and say, get rid of these knobs that's coming out, align the, I don't know why. Right, none of that. I don't want any framing that's going to be like that. The balconies which are framed around the corners of the building, come on, simplify. Parquet, align it with the exterior of the building. Why are you jutting out by 6 feet? And I have to maintain this membrane. I know it's details, right? But it's kind of like similar to legal argument. Have a good legal contract, have a good architect. So you build simple buildings. You save amazing amount of per square cost per foot if you have a smart architect and a builder at the table that are good at savings. But then put in things that make sense from the community building point of view. Playgrounds, communal rooms. It's a great idea, and I'm sure you do it as well.
I don't know if this might not be on. Yeah, we're gonna do one more question because we have an opportunity to kind of have a walkthrough of the exhibition. And so we're going to take one more question, and people can ask the panelists questions individually after. Sean.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Back to you, Sean.
I'll try not to hurt myself here.
You're our favorite.
So from a person from Central Canada, I believe in Calgary, and I think you will bounce back, so I'd be optimistic. I think Canada is a wonderful place, a wonderful country, and we're certainly experiencing it in Toronto in terms of international investment and international development community. We don't have really a local development community anymore. Everything is globalized, financialized, whatever you want to say. We right now have a very hot debate going on in Toronto about the presence of Google and a project called Sidewalk Labs, where we have 400 acres within walking distance of our downtown that is to be developed in the next 30 to 50 years. So some of the learnings that Vincent is experiencing in the larger city scale redevelopments are things that we are learning from as well as it relates to other challenges the city has. I'm interested though, Vincent, particularly, if you could share your thoughts around your developer partner, because I noticed in your presentation you didn't even name the development partner.
Daniel's corporate. I couldn't
Yeah,
even
no,
name it
I'm not, and this isn't to advertise your development partner, but on a number of your larger development projects, you've chosen to do them in phases, and you indicated what the phases were, and you've awarded the development partner by phase, as opposed to having the development partner for the entire project. And what are the implications of having used that phased approach as opposed to having a development partner where they would have the certainty of being your partner through the entire project? Pros and cons.
So maybe this actually goes to one of your lessons learned question earlier as well. So Daniels Building Corporation is our partner on Regent Park, and they were the second developer that was awarded through a public RFP process at Regent Park. The first, when we first went out, the developer partner at the time was awarded, and then once they kind of understood the magnitude of the undertaking, they withdrew from that. And so we had to go out again. But there were some lessons learned around that, they had, the first developer kind of brought some insight to the table, and so we modified. And so what isn't reflected in any of the slides is TCHC was the bank for the first phase. We financed the construction of the market condos. And we, Toronto operates on a pre-sale model. You sell 75% of the units, 70% of the units from a floor plan. Then the bank says, okay, you've sold enough, I'll kick in the rest, and then you start construction. So TCHC started funding the construction of the market buildings before Daniels even opened the sales office. And that was to show the broader city transformative change was coming to Regent Park. Luckily, it was a successful approach. And so when we partnered with Daniels for phase 1, in their contract, we gave them the rights to phase 2, and it was up to TCHC to award that to them, and so that's how we proceeded. When we awarded them phase 2, we also, in the agreement, said, okay, you know what, we're actually going to give you the rest of it. So we awarded Daniels the remaining phases of Regent Park. Then when it came to negotiating phase 3, when we went to a land sale model, because our board was kind of getting risk averse and they wanted to not be a partner in the project anymore, we amended the agreement with Daniels. We took out phase 4 and 5, and then we kind of moved forward with phase 3. And the reason why was because there was a recognition that TCHC wasn't benefiting as much as we could have from the increase in the land value that was being generated in the development. And that's why now we typically move to a phased approach where we'll partner with the developer for one phase, realize the uptick in the market, and then we'll go back out and hopefully get a better land and profit split as we continue to develop.